Welcome, everyone. I'm so thrilled with this turnout the day before the election on a Monday. I'm Jessica Pressman. I'm a professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature, and I'm co-founder and co-director with Pam Lack of the Digital Humanities Initiative. And it is our sincere and truly deep honor today to get to welcome and showcase the work of our friend and colleague, Joanna Brooks. Joanna is, as you probably all know, I'll just give you a little brief bio of this amazing human, an award-winning author and editor of 10 books on race, religion, gender, social movements, and American culture. She's published so broadly, it's just so great, from prestigious academic presses to global mass media outlets like The Daily Show, NPR, BBC, Washington Post. She is currently Associate Vice President for Faculty Advancement and Student Success at San Diego State, but she is also, importantly to me and some of my colleagues here, a professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at San Diego State. And she is co-founder and really the true visionary of the Digital Humanities Initiative here at State. We are eternally grateful for her pioneering vision, always a pioneering vision in all that she does. She works, and this is especially important now, as an important volunteer and activist and organizer in labor, feminist, anti-racist, LGBTQ, equality, and migrant rights movements. She has her PhD from my alma mater, UCLA. And I am just so, she's a dear, dear friend to me, someone that I admire, look up to, appreciate in all aspects of her human being. And there's no one I'd rather hear from on this day before the election. So please join me in virtually welcoming Joanna Brooks.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I'm very touched, and I know a lot of us are carrying a lot of anxiety today. I wish we were all in the same room so we could feel the warmth of being together as people who care deeply about ideas and about humanity. But I hope that what I can offer by way of my voice and my story will suffice. And I want to thank Pam for posting the land acknowledgement in the chat. That's an important part of what we do here at Sdsu. I know we have a lot of visitors not from campus, so I'm very proud to work at an institution where we make that a part of our institutional life. I also just want to acknowledge different communities coming together in this room and people in this room who I consider decades long friends and even elders, people who have taught me a great deal. So Dr. Jane Hafen is in the room, and I just want to honor her and call her out for respect because she has been at this work much longer than I have, as well as there are women in this room who have been in this work with me for decades. So I love you guys, and it's nice to see you. I wish we were all together. Okay, and thank you, of course, Pam and Jessica, for convening this event. I'm going to talk about a book I wrote that came out in June. and I'm going to do it, hang on, I'm going to do it kind of awkwardly because whenever I go into screen share with this, I always do it wrong. So let's start that again. I'm going to talk about race and racism and white supremacy. And I'm going to talk about it as it relates to my own faith tradition and my own history, my own story. And my main hope is that by sharing my story and the story of my community, I can help others reflect on what our current state of affairs has cost us all as human beings. It is right and good to understand how murderous racial capitalism has been for communities of color. We have to sit with that and be accountable for that. It has also profoundly disfigured people who are identified as white. And counting those costs is, I feel, my work, so I can understand as a humanist what it means to be fully human. So that's the spirit in which I do my work. And I want to start out by sharing some key definitions. Maybe you're not in the field of ethnic studies or you're newer to this conversation. There may be some folks from my own neighborhood. We have a Del Cerro for Black Lives Matter neighborhood association. If anyone from my neighborhood is in the group, welcome, welcome. Hello. Oh, my neighbors are waving. I live on Romany. Good to see you. I'm very, very proud to live in a neighborhood where we are organized as citizens and neighbors to create a visual environment, at least, that we have all over our neighborhood, our Black Lives Matter posted signs, thanks in large part to a student organizer, a student here who is an organizer. His name is Morgan Hatch. So anyway, so what is racism? And my go-to definition comes from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, whose book, Golden Gulag, I highly recommend. And it's a very technical term because she's a geographer, but then there's sort of a translation underneath it. So it's the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. What does that mean? Well, it means that there's a system. And there's a system that hands out life chances. And it means that based on, your skin color and your ancestry, just by virtue of being born, statistically, you're going to have a different set of life chances, right? Just you'll be statistically more likely to die too young or to end up in prison just by virtue of being born with a certain skin color. And those differences are artificial, right? There is no genetic basis to race as we understand it. And there is no genetic basis to whiteness. What is whiteness and where does it come from? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Like, when does the word white start mattering, start taking on value? My original training was as an early Americanist. And if you look back to the earliest centuries, the earliest imperial centuries of North America, you'll find that in those very, very early, even like pre-1600s, 1610s, 1620s, that white and African and indigenous peoples were moved freely and unfreely across the Atlantic in the service of expropriating human labor, appropriating indigenous land. Like there was just a lot of movement of people, and white people moved unfreely as well, of course, as indentured servants. But what you find happening in colonial law, especially in Virginia and surrounding areas, starting in somewhat starting in like 30s, 40s, is that laws are passed that say that if a Black person is baptized, that doesn't automatically free them from slavery, right? This is a pre-racial moment where people were enslaved on the basis generally of whether they were considered a heathen or a Christian, or if they were economically under duress, they were made unfree. And for a while, some Black folks argued that if they became Christian, they could, that was grounds for emancipation from slavery. And really early in the colonial statutes, that gets eroded. But what really starts striking the sharp difference and differentiating between white and Black and the fortunes of unfree white people and unfree Black people in North America are the laws passed in the 70s and 80s that legally differentiates white servitude, which is defined as being termed, right? You can term out 7 years, pay your bills, get your land, from Black enslavement, which is defined as being heritable, right? It will be passed through by virtue of your birth, right? Typically through the maternal line. So right away you see this effort to split this underclass, right? And to advantage those who appear to be white. And why is that? Well, we see in the 60s and the 70s, that's the 1660s and the 1670s, white and Black uprising and revolting against colonial landowners and plantation owners. And what's the quickest way to put down that rebellion is to divide people against each other. What grows from that, of course, is the system of race-based chattel slavery that we understand from our history. And the great W.B. Du Bois theorized in 1935 in his book Black Reconstruction. He took a real good critical look at what whiteness had become. And he said, whiteness is this group category that the poorest and most degraded white-looking people can get into and feel better about themselves and decide not to make common cause with the poorest and most degraded Black-looking people. So it's a public and psychological wage, right? It's a little extra boost, something that you feel good about, that is a buy-off so that you don't organize with people of color. That's a powerful idea. Okay, next one, if I can figure out how to make this work. There we go, hang on. Okay, there we go. So how does whiteness function today? The brilliant groundbreaking article is by the legal scholar Cheryl Harris in '93, Whiteness is Property. And Harris argues that whiteness actually, she traces through years and years and years and years of legal judgments and of case law, the fact that plaintiffs are able to sue to protect and insist on their whiteness as some kind of a capital advantage to themselves, and to sue for damages, whatever that advantage is, is threatened or compromised. And this leads to a series of books that were very, 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 very impactful on me when I was studying in grad school. Noel Ignatius, How the Irish Became White, George Lips's The Possessive Investment in Whiteness, and Karen Brodkin's How Jews Became White Folks. And what these historians teach us is that, no group is born white. Like, the Irish were not considered white when they came to the United States. Jews were maybe not considered white, and then maybe not. Depends on what day, depends on who's around. And many, many groups after migrating to the United States, this is Euro-American groups, or even more broadly, North African American groups, even some Asian American groups, managed to pass as white, right? They start checking that white box on the census. And whiteness is the product, and these are my words, kind of derived from this learning, of group solidarity among those who pass as white and are willing to exchange broader forms of human solidarity, as well as legacy forms of historical memory and oppositional consciousness, in exchange for immunity from some forms of state violence, alleviation of some forms of individual and social discomfort, and state protected and advantaged access to mobility, opportunity, and property on the condition of one's ongoing agreement not to challenge white interests, right? So to be a little more plain spoken about it, I pass as white in some settings. In other settings, I kind of pass differently. But I pass as white in most settings. People are going to see me as a white person. They're going to look at my last name. They're going to look at my skin color, and they're going to say, okay, she's a white girl. And because of that, I will pass through life with immunity to being pulled over and searched by the police. I will have immunity against some forms of state violence, some forms of being beaten on the street just because. I will have more likely access to family wealth, right? The family wealth, because of historical policies on who could and couldn't qualify for home loans, for example, white families have about 10 times the intergenerational wealth of Black families, just as a product of legal history and financial history. So I'm gonna have that stuff just by passing, just by getting along. That's how whiteness functions. Okay. Okay, there we go. And so how is whiteness reproduced, right? So whiteness is, these are structures, these are ideological structures, these are idea structures that we're sort of born into, and we learn to swim in, and we're raised in, we breathe like oxygen, and they habituate us, they teach us how to be white. And this learning is often instantiated through predominantly white institutions, right? So universities, colleges, churches, these are the spaces where we learn how to get along with white people, what the rules of being a white person are. And these are not, so when I talk about white supremacy, I'm not talking about tiki torch. I'm talking about mainstream institutions that teach us to love what is white and associate it with good things, even if it's symbolically, which is where the religion thing becomes so important. How many of us think about, our churches are some of the most segregated spaces in American life, right? And in churches, we learn, if you grew up going to church, you learn what goodness is, what morality is. And in the book, I talk about basically American Christianity as having developed this very, very narrow middle class, very, very meek notion of morality as don't sleep with anyone else's spouse, don't say bad words, and pay your offerings, right? And that's what makes you good. That's moral, not morality as engage deeply with the defining social questions of your time. Take personal responsibility for the hungry on your streets and don't stop agitating until it's solved, right? Like, how many churches, white mainstream American churches, say it is holy to rock the boat? It is holy to make a giant stink. We go to church and we're typically in these spaces, unless you're maybe like in the Pentecostal world, which is a wonderful world. But like, if you were in sort of a mainline Protestant church, it was like very quiescent. The notion of reverence and holiness going together among white folks as stillness and keeping your mouth shut. This teaches us how to be white, among other things. Okay, so the question is there a way out, right? It's a club that you are kind of born into and you sort of are trained how to belong to it. Is there any way out? when I was, in graduate school and studying most intently, I had the good fortune to come across the work of Professor Noel Ignatieff, who had written How the Irish Became White. And I started reading and affiliating with a journal called Race Trader, which is around in the 90s. And I want to share this quote with you as probably one of the most powerful informants of my work. And the white race consists of those who partake of the privileges of white skin. Its most wretched members, and this is the Du Boisian, note, the most wretched members of the white race share a status higher in certain respects than those of the most exalted persons excluded from it, in return for which they give their support to the system that degrades them. The existence of the white race depends upon the willingness of those assigned to it to place their racial interests above class, race, gender, or any other interest they hold. The defection of enough of its members to make it unreliable as a predictor of behavior will set off tremors that will lead to its collapse. Treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity. And by which the editorial board meant not abolish white people, but abolish whiteness as a construct that has the power to motivate behavior. When I get onto a bus or enter a meeting room, do I make eye contact only with white people? Why do I do that? Where did I learn that? What does that mean? What does that shape? What do I assume about others? How do I present myself? What solidarity do I express in that moment? I mean, this is sewed into so many everyday behaviors, from where we live to how we educate our children to how we grow and eat our food. Like it is embedded in structures around us. All right, so this book. I can't tell this book without telling a part of my own history. I was born in Linwood, right there. Linwood is a Black Los Angeles neighborhood. My father was from Bell Gardens over here. My mother's family was from here. I come from a segregated city. The city of Los Angeles is one of the most segregated cities on the face of the earth. Okay, sorry, I need to go back. If I can go back there. My roots, because it's important that we all know where we're from. My grandfather's family were Basque immigrants to Los Angeles. They were not Mormon. My paternal grandmother's family were mixed race Okie people. They had converted to the church. And then my mother's people were multi-generational, we call it pioneer stock, which is they crossed the plains carrying actual hand carts, Anglo-Mormons. And that's something special, kind of, if you're a Mormon. People tend to brag about that. So I just did. When I do something ridiculous, I say it's my pioneer stock. Just blame it on that. Okay, this is me. I wrote this book too. You should know I was brought up deeply faithful, and I still am, to my bones, a person of faith. Although that's morphed a great deal in my lifetime, but I still identify as a Mormon very deeply. I was brought up with a deep love for the Mormon concept of Zion, the idea that the point of it all was to build communities where people would be safe and taken care of, and where the pure in heart, would look after each other. I loved that idea from the time I was a very, very small person. And I also was brought up with a very deep sense of cultural and oppositional identity. This wasn't abstract. Growing up in like the 80s we did white flight in Orange County, California. People made fun of Mormons at school quite a bit. People ridiculed our worship. I had notes left in my locker that said I was a cult member. I was singled out and humiliated. So I had a very oppositional sense of identity. Like, whatever this mainstream thing is, that's very cruel, and I don't want any part of it. So the history of the church. Mormonism as a movement starts organizing in the 1820s. There are, of course, Black Mormons who are ordained to the lay priesthood in the 1830s. The exodus to Utah Territory takes place in the 40s and following. Utah Territory legalizes slavery in the early 1850s. It is not until the early 20th century the church officially institutionalizes a ban on the ordination of Black men to the priesthood. And the priesthood of Mormonism is a lay priesthood, so every worthy male over the age of 12 is ordained to some form of priesthood service. The ban was ended without any sort of apology, really, in 1978 when I was 6 years old. But the rationale developed for the ban, and this is a page picture from an early church curriculum book, where we see the doctrinal scaffolding for segregation in Mormon priesthood start to be built. Racist rationale was taught through the 2010s. I was raised on it. I was raised on things that come from mainstream American Protestantism, like the idea of the curse of Cain being responsible for the origination of, a race, all of it. I was brought up on that. I was brought up on rationale for the ban that are specific to Mormon theology as well. Now, during my time at BYU in the early 1990s, I became connected to a grassroots, progressive Mormon intellectual and feminist community, some of whom are here today. And, through study, I'm calling it study because it wasn't institutionally supported. It was study. It was something different. It was, small feminist reading groups, and it was, symposiums the church discouraged people from attending, and it was independent publications. But through study, we came to understand that our people had abandoned a radical and inclusive vision of Zion for radical assimilation, including anti-Black racism. And this was even though Mormons had been othered as non-white in the 19th century. And this is the cover from my friend Paul Reeves' book. And you can see there sort of like, there's a lot of political cartooning of Mormons in the 19th century. And there you can see sort of the stereotypical Mormon elder with a long beard. And the caption for this political cartoon was, "These are all of his children by different mothers, of course," right? Signifying on Mormon polygamy. You can see this idea of a racial profligacy. Mormons were not considered white under the traditional sense in the 19th century. So my question is, why did we do this to ourselves? How and why did we do this to ourselves? How did we travel from a radical and inclusive vision of Zion where Black men were ordained in the 1830s to becoming probably the most outstanding exemplar of institutionalized religious segregation in the 20th? This question gained real urgency for me after 2016, of course, and in 2017 at Charlottesville, they had invited a LDS and very, very, very conservative Mormon identified female blogger to speak at Charlottesville. And some alt-right folks were using Mormon theology and images and doctrine to advance a white supremacist agenda. And our community had a moment of soul searching about why it was, well, at least the progressive part of it did, why our faith was a comfortable space for white supremacists, like openly white supremacists, not just everyday white supremacists. I wrote the first full draft in about 3 or 4 months. It just kind of went like that. It took some time to get through the publication process, which means that it came out on June 1st, which was a very, very tender time for it to come out because that was right after the murder of George Floyd. And there was the nation had been witness to a horrible crime. And I was in a place to be able to speak to some aspects of how my faith community had contributed to it. Silently, not directly, but contributed to the institutionalization of white supremacy. So here's the academic part. So what does this book do? It does 4 things. First, it theorizes white American Christianity as a technology for the production of racial innocence, by which I mean, and there's some wonderful legal scholarship on this. So racial innocence is this idea that individual white citizens are blameless for their structural advantages, that it is unjust. Like it comes out in cases around affirmative action, legality of affirmative action, where courts find that affirmative action penalizes unfairly white people, holding white people completely innocent and conceiving of damage in a way that is just ignorant to history. So this idea of racial innocence is perpetuated in dominantly white churches, is my experience. And I talk about that in detail in the book. I haven't done it justice here, but I'm happy to discuss the concept in more detail if people want. And then from that general theorization, I track through, and some of it is work that's new to me, and some of it is a synthesis from other histories, but I track I call them micro-political, so like those decisive moments at which deals get made that end up changing the course of history, as well as the institutional histories of white supremacy and Mormonism from the 1830s to the present, these nodes at which Mormonism began to privilege white lives over Black lives and then institutionalize this privileging. And then I try and take stock of the contradictions, distortion, denial, damages, and repressions that this did to us, the damage this did to us, including, I call it a possessive investment in rightness after George Lipsitz's phrase, the possessive investment in whiteness, which is based, of course, on Cheryl Harris's theorization. But this idea that like Mormons can be 20th century Mormons can be very rigid about our worldviews and about our beliefs, and very literal, and also holding that the leadership of the church is infallible. Mind you, that this notion of infallibility has only really been with us since the turn of the century. It's not a timeless, essential Mormon doctrine. And then finally, because hope is important, my book brings to light instances throughout our history that show that there were always Mormons who knew better and who did the right thing, always. You can't just say, oh, they were just a product of their time. Yeah, kind of, but there were always white people who knew this was all wrong, always. This is a quote from the book. It's a long one, forgive me, but this is what I mean. The possessive investment in rightness that was developed to shore up Mormonism's possessive investment in whiteness furnished the terms by which LDS church leaders managed a series of accommodations that secured Mormonism's survival and white Mormons access to the privileges of white American citizenship. But this has come at an expense. The possessive investment in whiteness and the possessive investment in rightness have put Mormons on the wrong side of many human struggles for dignity, autonomy, sovereignty, and well-being. They have allied the Mormon people with power structures that allocate life chances by race and made most Mormon people ignorant to the experiences of people of color. The possessive investment in rightness has stood in the way of engagement, conflict, and searching that lead to continuing revelation, which is a really dear concept in the Mormon faith. It has put the LDS Church in the impossible position of defending the purity and literal veracity of our faith's entire 19th century record, and has cut off from communion with the church those who could not do the same. Most importantly, the possessive investment in whiteness and the possessive investment in rightness have corroded the theological integrity of Mormonism as a Christian identified faith. A friend of mine who works at an NPR station in Salt Lake interviewed me and then made a film. I don't know. Well, I think it's just, how are we doing on time, Jess?
You're good. You're good. Show us.
All right. So this is a part. Let me get to the right screen. Stop share. Let me reshare. Oh, wrong one. Okay. And so this is based on an interview we did, and it should share sound as well. Can you hear the sound? Okay.
So I was writing some pages in the book in which I pulled together sort of a catalog of policy decisions and political stances LDS church leaders had taken against Black equality. And as I wrote the names of all these LDS church presidents and leaders, I realized these were the names of all of the buildings I spent years learning and worshiping and having fun in at Brigham Young University. It bears noticing that the people who became leaders of the church were people who actively valued discrimination against Black people long past the time when other faiths in the United States did. is worth asking ourselves, what are statues for? Why do we name buildings? Why do we name buildings after the people we name buildings after? What kind of environment does that create? What does it mean that every day, for example, as a student at Brigham Young University, I walked through and learned and had spiritual experiences in buildings that were named after people with abhorrent racial politics? Many of us move every day through built environments that are completely embedded with racialized histories, with histories of inequality. We don't even see it. None of these things are here by accident. Like Mormonism isn't predominantly white by accident. I thought we were white just because. We were white on purpose. We were white because Brigham Young intentionally established territorial theocracy, where in his vision, white men would rule over Black. And he established slavery as much to keep Black people out of the territory as he did to keep them as a captive labor force. Mormonism was white on purpose. I wonder the extent to which we can be profoundly racist and be profoundly inspired at the same time. I wonder. I don't know. But what I do know is that when we name buildings and when we invest in and maintain statues and center our cities around them, we idolize them. Like literally, we cast them as idols. They become emblems of power, and we choose emblems of power and center around emblems of power that are not brown, not Black, not female. They're about imperial forms of power. They're about theocracies that are premised on white supremacy. And that means something. We have choices as to how we furnish our lived environments. And those choices have real price tags, and they have real moral and cultural price tags as well.
I'm going to start sharing again. Please know that's hard for me to watch. Like gut-wrenchingly so. And about a week after that came out, it was reported that this happened at my alma mater. And it took 5 days for this to make the news because BYU hid it. But the Salt Lake Tribune broke the story that someone had come on camera. This is a remarkable thing. It's in Utah County. It's very solidly Mormon place. Someone had come onto campus and defaced the statues of Brigham Young and the names of various administration buildings. And it was like a gut punch to see that. And what I saw in it was deep shame by people who are from our community, who never wanted this to be a part of our history. And I see those people all the time. So this is Mitt Romney at the Black Lives Matter march in Washington, D.C. And this is his father, George Romney, when he was governor of Michigan, who marched with and organized with leaders of the civil rights movement. And when Mitt is pushed about why sometimes he steps out of form and does the things he does, he quotes a Mormon hymn. You know, do what is right, let the consequence follow. And that's how I was raised. I just want to end by offering this opportunity in this space for everybody to reflect. And this is the great Grace Lee Boggs, who I want to grow up to be like someday, but will fall far short. And I love this quote, because I hope you can tell my talk is one about using our academic tools to turn on and work arduously with the places we come from and the people we love. You cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it. So in that spirit, I would just ask those of you who are white identified in this room today, how and when did your people become white? What did they and you gain by it? What did they and you lose? What would it mean to defect from white solidarity and keep defecting? Because I wish it were just some one thing you could do that was one thing any of us could do, but it's not. It is the rest of our lives. And what consequences might follow if we did start defecting? And are those consequences any different than the realities people of color face every day. I think they're actually lighter. And what might we gain? And with that, I say thank you. And thank you for your time and attention. I think we have a healthy amount of time for discussion. I think Jessica will curate. But if you feel that you benefited from this presentation, I would encourage you to consider a donation to SDSU's Black Resource Center. And there's a link here that I can share with Pam and Jessica and put in the chat. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Joanna. Just extraordinary. I am sure that there are a lot of questions, and we will take them in the chat. I'll start while everyone is typing. That was extraordinary in so many ways, and one of the things that you've taught certainly me to do is to think about how to use my academic training as a scholar to do good in the world, and you certainly do that and model that. And I'd like to ask you about, I mean, this is let me just show everyone the book, right? Here it is, it's extraordinary. And it is an archive, and one that is also uses archives and builds its own archive in really extraordinary ways. So from MA and dissertations that have not been published, to newspaper articles, to personal stories, to songs, I mean, and to statues, as you're saying. And I'd like to know how you feel about, how you think about this as an archival project, and perhaps one that is creating an archive upon which hopefully other people will build.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. So it allows me to share a real truth of how this book came about. So in 2017, after Charlottesville, some of us in the progressive Mormon community started organizing around sort of an anti-racist curriculum. And could we develop something based on our own theology that we could circulate? Could we get people bought on to embedding anti-racist theology or questions or ideas in their spiritual practice in our community? And it really didn't go very far. And I was kind of sitting there one day in my house wrestling with it, saying, that didn't go very far. What should I do? And this thought came to my mind, and like a good Mormon, I always listen when things come to my mind. And it said, go to the archive. So I did, and I realized that all of this study we had done as progressive Mormons, this sort of story we told each other in places like camp, thank you, Jane Ann, like this truth of our history we had put together, it wasn't all there. So that book I flashed up for you, Whiteness of a Different Color, like that was there. It ends in about the 1870s. But the story wasn't all there of how we did this to ourselves from the 1830s to the present. And so, and I knew as I was putting the book together, I was going to have to. There's some photos in the book, and I was sitting there in the archives in the U of U looking at some of these letters back and forth, and I knew I have to take a picture of this and put it in the book. People will not believe me if I tell them that early LDS Sunday school texts were sourced from Confederate histories. They will not believe me unless I take a picture of the page and put it in the book. So that's literally, Jessica, I meant to, and the life stories of people that, like, I grew up not knowing about the Udalls, about the great Udall brothers, our Arizona politicians who were staunch civil rights advocates from the beginning. It was Stuart Udall as Secretary of the Interior who forced the Washington formerly named racist team to desegregate because their stadium was on federal land, right? Like there were Mormons doing good stuff. Oh, I knew about none of them. And so to put those stories in a book and say, please know that at every step of the way, we were awful and we were better. That was, it meant to serve as an archive, Jessica, so thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. We have a few questions. Questions actually about how the church has responded, if it has, to your book and perhaps even your previous research. And also in terms of this kind of a follow-up, like how this putting these documents out there puts you in any kind of position in relationship to the church.
Yeah, so great question. I mean, for sure, I will never be invited to speak at Brigham Young University. Never. That's been the case for a very long time, probably since I gave back my diploma in 1993. So, it's just never going to happen. There are people the church calls in and listens to. I am not one of them, and that's okay. I'm very comfortable with that. I've always had the sense that, like, I am supposed to do my job, and the people who lead the church are supposed to do theirs. And I'm not here to call them out. I'm here to tell the truth of our history as my scholarship allows. and to speak as fearlessly and as lovingly as I can. And so I really don't try to pick any fights, and I have not been harmed at all.
Great. And again, if you all have questions, please write them in the chat and I will read them to Dr. Brooks. I want to ask you about that, the positionality of being, as you still describe yourself, a person of faith and a scholar. And I know we were trained in the same place as academics, so we were in some ways trained to hold all things personal and subjective at a minimum as we do our archival and scholarly work. So how have you worked against that? How do you, I mean, I know how I see it beautifully in the written pages, but would you speak to holding those two subjectivities in simultaneously?
Sure. And so I started, I was part of this group of grassroots intellectual Mormon folks from the time I was at BYU. Really good fortune to fall into such a great group of people. And I tried to do some Mormon studies work when I was in grad school, but I had our graduate advisor tell me that I shouldn't put this article or that on my transcript, on my CV when I applied for jobs, because someone might think I was Mormon. So, that was 98. I was like, well, the degree from Brigham Young University might give it away, like, are you serious? Like, I'm Mormon. Like, that's just what I am. If someone's got a problem with it, that's their thing. So, but it took me a while, Jessica. Like, I didn't start writing about Mormonism in the public sphere until 2009, 10-ish. Mormon studies had not been developed, in part because the church is very tight about its messaging, about its publishing, about what's counted as official. And it had been, until just 10 years ago, Mormon people have been extraordinarily allergic to things written about Mormonism that weren't published by the church. Extreme suspicion of Mormon studies programs. And so there wasn't a lot of space to do Mormon studies. And so I just didn't until I was at a place in life where I could. And my memoir was the way back in to writing about my faith. And but I see my faith in everything I ever wrote, because again, it goes back to that vision of Zion that was dear to me from the time I was just a really small child, where I was like, this can't be it. This cruelty around me, this isn't it.
We have a great question from our friend and former colleague, Angel David Nieves. Hi. Which is about how do we differentiate for our students? And I think this book really is it's such a clearly written pedagogical book, you guys. Like, it's so beautifully written. How do we differentiate for our students between whiteness and white supremacy in ways that can make those terms clearer? Identity, ideology, how do we do that kind of work?
Yeah, thank you, Angel. And hello, Richard, good to see you. We miss you. This is where I think, and not just students, but, family members, community members, because that's the tough thing about whiteness, is we're so hidden from each other, and we're also, it's the thing that shall not be named, right? But I think it's just so important to lead with the acknowledgement that this is a structure, not a character defect. This is a structure, not a character defect, just over and over again. This is a structure. You didn't choose to, be vested with an immunity against some forms of state violence. You didn't know. Like, whiteness is designed to be a self-perpetuating system, and no one talk about it. No one pull back the curtain and look at the man behind the curtain. Like, we all just kind of go along, not talking about lots of really important things. And agree to be silent and talk only about Pottery Barn catalogs, and at some point that stunts your heart and soul. I'm getting a laugh from Angel. At some point that just stunts people. It damages and disfigures us. Like, we all get to this moment, and it's 2020, and Black men are murdered in the streets by the police, and we're like, what do I say? Right? And this was a big summer for a lot of us who had never spoken out before. So, I think it's important just to create these spaces. As one of my friends and accountability partners, Misha McGrigg, says, tough on institutions, tender on people, right? It's a structure that you are born into, and you didn't choose it. You can start to choose out. Not that you're ever going to be exempt of those privileges. It's really insidious, but you can start choosing to speak out when it's uncomfortable. You can start choosing to just put your weight with, Noel said what it meant to be a race traitor was, he told his kid this. Noel said, it was to yell as loud yell as loud for the kid who didn't get as big a piece of cake as you would yell if you didn't get a big piece of cake. That's what it means to be a race traitor, right? Just holler. So that's what I tell students and others who are new to this conversation. It's a structure. It's not a character defect.
Thank you. We have another question, which is about where you holler. And this brings in your digital humanities aspect of this book project. By the way, the Digital Humanities Initiative at San Diego State, which Joanna co-founded, is dedicated to global diversity. So this is one of the reasons that we are hosting this talk today. But another is the way you even just showed us a video of using tweets. But when this book came out, you did a brilliant education on Facebook for folks, which I'd like you to talk about. And it comes actually from one of the questions from Shen Zheng in the chat, which is a question of posting a timeline of Black repression on social media recently. And a former student chided me, saying that as an academic, I should know better, as he and his family are blameless. So I would like to hear you speak to this question of how you use the social media to speak out, to holler for that piece of cake for others, and also to teach others, like all of us, academics and beyond, how to think about using these new tools at our disposal to educate ourselves and others.
Yeah, and it's tricky because I watched The Social Dilemma finally, and I'm like, okay. And I wonder, I'm trying to do a lot of reflection on, as we all are, I think right now, on what really is the political power of the digital. And I think the algorithms are just eating all of us alive. But I will say that in the space of Mormonism, when you had an institution that highly controlled, it was very, very, very top down, vertical control of messaging, publishing, information, affiliation. The internet for us, especially social media, especially after about 2010, served as an amazing resource for finding other people who were potentially non-literal believers, who were feminists, who were queer, who were dissenters. And I mean, we used to rely on newsletters, like mimeograph newsletters, and now we could find each other and support each other in real time. And also in real life settings, like we actually have organized real life settings to supplement what's online. Now, I don't know how much, there's at some point, I'm always listening when I post things. I'm like, okay, who is this for? What is the specific cultural work I'm trying to do? Am I just yelling into the void? Am I just another voice yelling? Is this just another repost? Do I really need to do this? Like, who is this really for? And where I try and aim is I try and wait. And the fact that the book came out the time it did was very spooky and very humbling, and I tried to be very reverential with that coincidence. And I tried to use it as a time just to say to my people where I come from, just to say, hey, this is our mess. Here's our part of this. We're just gonna get this all out there. And we're just gonna push it out on the lawn and hose it down and call it what it was, because there's been so much justification and rationalization, and we can't be free until we do this. And one of my favorite points of feedback was, from a dear college friend who had always been just a good person, and said, I could never wrap my head around the race thing. Like, it was always so painful and shameful to me. And the fact that you just kind of put it all out there on the lawn, I can breathe now. I can see it for what it is. And I think that's the thing, like, so I try to be very mindful, and I'm sorry about the chimes. I was trying to keep my phone on to keep an eye on the time, to be honoring of everyone's time. But, I think that's the thing, to be very intentional about the use of social media, to recognize what a privilege it is to have access to a broad, a horizontal community of peers, to cultivate it and nourish it generously, and not just to be another voice shouting in the void.
Well, I am cognizant. There's my dog in the background. I am cognizant of time, and Joanna Brooks does run our university, my friends. But we do have probably time for one more question, and this is a really good one.
Fake news. That's the first thing that came to mind. I'm so sorry. That's fake news, Jessica.
Fake news. Sorry. Well, luckily we have her as a leader at the helm. But one more question, which you actually brought up, LGBTQ in relation to the church, and this is a really good question from an audience member. Does your research also delve into the church's consistently morphing stance on LGBTQ+? I think back to the 2008 campaign fight for Prop 8 and the church actively pouring money and support into California. The church seems to have the history of marginalizing many groups beyond just race. Do you want to speak to that?
Absolutely. And yes, and Prop 8 was one of the most painful experiences of my life. And I want you to know that there were many of us who organized and did our very best to fight something that was impossible, and tried to warn people that they should not underestimate Mormon political organizing, and were ignored. So anyway, this book does not do that. It seeks to acknowledge intersectionalities between interlocking forms of oppression, of course, at every turn, including calling out some Black Mormons who used their Blackness to oppose civil rights for LGBT people during the Prop 8 years. And so the work of understanding our homophobia is well underway. There are a number of books that richly document the contradictions between our own histories of non-monogamy, non-heteronormative, marriage and sexuality, love, and our extraordinarily radically assimilative anti-queer politics in the 20th and 21st centuries. And so Michael Quinn is an amazing historian who has done this work. I would point also more recently to the work of Taylor Petrie, who has a recent book out called Tabernacles of Clay, which is remarkable. So this work is being done, and I'm happy to contribute as I can.
Well, with that, and knowing that we just have a few minutes before 3, I want to sincerely, personally thank you, Joanna Brooks, for your time, your brilliance, for your archival work, for your scholarship, for your leadership in all things. And I also want to thank all of you for taking time to be here and get educated with us. So if you will, one set of hands clapping for everyone else. Thank you all so much. This book talk will be recorded and will be posted to, Pam, will you put that in the chat? To our website at teachdh.sdsu.edu. So you can refer back to it and share it with other folks. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Pam. Thank you, everyone here, and all the dear, dear friends from everywhere. So good to see everyone. Please be safe and please deep breaths through tomorrow and the next 2 weeks.